Welcome to our webinar, the National Environmental Policy Act Overview, and what does it mean? Terracon has a cool little video that says NEPA is not just a horrible, ugly four-letter word. And that is the mission for today, is to kind of go over what that means, kind of do like an overview about NEPA, and also how we can integrate what we do from Terracon and comply with NEPA into Pivot as well. And because I'm presenting, I'm turning off my screen so that way you can focus on my slides versus my amazing face. So, all right. Again, thank you for everyone for coming today. So within Terracon, we're incident injury free, and we've learned that doing environmental work and materials and geotech and all the services that we provide is that we learned that our employees are our most important asset. And so we always like to have a meeting start with an incident injury-free moment. And since I am a NEPA practitioner, a lot of my time is spent at a desk. So I kind of just want to go over ways to you can stretch at your desk, kind of keep your body moving. We tend to, when we do work from a stationary position, we work for too long. We just kind of get in the zone and we start working and then don't realize that we've been sitting there for 3 to 4 hours. So a big thing to kind of keep in mind is try to, stretch 2 to 3 times a day. If you need to, set an alarm on your phone, on your watch. I bought myself a smart watch because it reminds you of, hey, it's been 2 hours, you need to move. But constantly keep your body in motion. And here are a couple of little stretches that you can do while you're sitting or standing at your desk to kind of just keep the motion going. Don't sit too long, and it's just better for you.
Jennifer, I'm so sorry. I'm going to stop you for 1 second.
Yes.
Because we're having an issue with the recording, and I want to make sure we get that. So I'm sorry, everybody. I just want to make sure we get the recording going. I'm not sure why it is not. So sorry, guys. We're just going to navigate this real fast.
Let's see if I have any options.
Sorry, team. I'm just going to work through this real fast. I'm not quite sure why it's not letting me record. Sorry, guys. You'd think after all of these years of doing these these recorded webinars, we would have this figured out. And I apologize, we did not. All right, Rob just pinged me. Thank you, Rob, who's saying the recording has started. I think I'm just not seeing it on my end. So, all right, Jennifer, again, sorry to interrupt. Sorry, everybody, for those technical difficulties. Flip phone. Yes.
Phone, I love it. Absolutely. I love it.
I love it. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for being patient. Again, I'm great at marketing, not so great at the technical stuff. Jennifer, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
You and me both. I still think there are gremlins and little creatures in my computer that make things run. So
Absolutely.
that's totally the world I live in.
Awesome. All right. All right. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Go right ahead.
No, thank you. So there's IIF for a moment. So I just want to kind of give everyone a brief overview of what Terracon does or who we are. I know that there are people on this presentation or on this webinar that are internal to Terracon, but also externally. So we got to plug ourselves. That's just what we do. So Terracon has, over 6,000 employees. We win the war on dots, is what I say. Local projects are key. If you have a local project, if you have a project, we more likely have an office located near the project or within close proximity. And like kind of mentioned before with the IIF moment, we do offer facilities, environmental, geotechnical, and material services. And I think the biggest plug about Terracon is that we are employee owned. So everything that we do is for our client, but also for ourselves. And so it makes us, I think, a little bit more cost conscious. As per those service lines, geotechnical, materials, facilities, and environmental, these are the sectors that we work within. And all of these nowadays with the federal funding, we work within these markets. So especially federal, I'm the joint venture federal program manager. So that's near and dear to my heart. Power and wind generations, solar, wind, healthcare, transportation, commercial, which is data centers, large commercial buildings like mall. No one goes to a mall anymore, but shopping centers and things like that, and then digital infrastructure. So those are the services in the market sectors that we have. Myself, and so that way you know who's speaking to you today on this beautiful Tuesday is I'm Jennifer Trombley Peters. I have over 24 years of environmental experience. I know you guys can read. Of those, 15 years of experience are for NEPA. Prior to that, I was working within the Environmental Protection Agency, doing environmental responses, spills, that kind of thing. And I saw that I would much rather plan to ensure that those concerns didn't happen. So I became a planner versus a responder. And while I've been at Terracon, I am now the NEPA program manager. So I provide oversight and guidance for our NEPA staff throughout the country and throughout the Central Operating Group, which is basically the whole entire central swath of the United States. And most of the agencies I work with, so all the NEPA kind of agency roles I know about are USDA, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Veterans Affairs, Army Corps of Engineers. I cut my teeth on DOD back in 15 plus years ago. So if it has an acronym, more likely than not, I've worked on it. But those are the agencies that I have a lot of experience in doing. So that is who I am. And I always like a fun fact about, I would like to throw in fun facts on the list because I probably don't want it in writing. But I would say a fun fact about me is, I don't know if it's I think it's fun. But when my husband and I were on our honeymoon, we were so tired after hiking in Alaska for 20 plus miles that we had an Arctic fox walk by us. And we're like, oh, look, it's an Arctic fox. And on any other day, I would be excited and I would just be super giddy. But I was just like, oh, there's a fox. That's great. Didn't take a picture, didn't do anything. It was just there. So I just thought that was interesting and just kind of sad that you didn't embrace it at the moment. But I was just really, really tired. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you have questions, please put it in the chat box. I think there is a Q&A, but I don't really use that very often. So please put that in the chat box, or you can put it in the chat box at the end. We'll have time for questions. Especially if you think you're going to forget it, please put it in there and we'll get to it later. Or if you want to wait to the end of the presentation and speak and ask a question, you're more than welcome to do so as well. Just raise your hand at the end and we can talk about your question, or we can have maybe a roundtable discussion, whatever it would be, in order to answer your needs. So feel free to put those questions in the chat box. We'll take care of it from there. All right, so on to the main course of today's discussion, NEPA. So just a quick history of NEPA. And we always throw out acronyms. The world we live in is full of acronyms. For most environmental stuff, we just throw out 4, 5, 6-letter words constantly. But NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act was created in 1969. In the late 1960s, early 70s, a lot of environmental regulations came about. Hence the little I Heart with Nixon. He did Clean Water Act. He did CERCLA, I think, as well. A lot of the environmental regulations came from a person and an administration in a time that you wouldn't think. So NEPA started in 1969. It's very short, very sweet, which is kind of nice. It doesn't bog you down in too many rules and regulations, but it did create the Council of Environmental Quality, and they're the ones who kind of put forth the actual guidance documents. And when you're looking at those environmental rules and regs, we always refer to the 40 CFR Part 1500. That's the actual act itself. It says hey, if you're going to do a category exclusion, this is the definition. Or, oh, if you're going to do this, that's the definition of that. That's where we always pull our information from, is 40 CFR. And again, because it's short and sweet, and it's very kind of open-ended, most of the rules of the road, if you want to call it, are based upon case law and precedent. It's kind of like when everything goes to the Supreme Court or goes to a higher court, you always use those case laws as precedent. NEPA is the exact same way. If someone said that a project is excluded from NEPA because of this, and then it went to court and was upheld, we can continue to use that ruling to justify that that project or that proposed project is excluded from NEPA. We continually use those cases to kind of hone the requirements of the law. Also, because it's very case law and precedent oriented, NEPA doesn't really have a whole lot of environment. It doesn't have a whole lot of teeth. With some environmental regulations, if you sign a manifest or you have information that goes to EPA, you sign your name to it, you can be held liable for that. And particularly, or the company you work for, could get a fine. You could go to jail. There's other things that could happen to you on a personal level or from a corporate level. Within NEPA, the only thing that can happen to you is someone can, or an organization or an individual can sue the applicant, sue the agency to stop the action. That's the only kind of recourse that you have. No one's going to jail, no one's doing anything like that. You would just be stuck in litigation. So your project may not move forward, or you may have having to modify your project in order to find a amicable solution to the people who have put forth that lawsuit. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to this real quick. So, like I said, 1969, the act was started. 1978, we got our more rules of the road. Everything stayed the same until 2020, where there were new rules put forth within the regulation. Certain things were put in, certain things were taken out. And then this year, it made official of what was taken in, what was taken out, because administration changed. So we have some new rules that came out based upon what had been removed, what had been added, and now what we have today is what we consider the official rules of NEPA, the official rules of NEPA. In the new rules, they added more categorical exclusions. So, and we'll go into all these definitions later, but they added more options for applicants and federal agencies to kind of work within the process. They did increase the requirement for public engagement. The term that we used to use is public involvement. Now they want more public engagement, not just providing a document for public review, but truly asking the people where the project is going to be located. Hey, do you guys have any questions, concerns, suggestions? Making it more of a conversation versus a informational kind of process. The other thing is they include timelines. Environmental assessments have to be completed within 1 year. And environmental impact statements, like the big, think of Keystone Pipeline, those kinds of things, big dredging operations, have to be done within 2. There's no definition as to when that timeline starts. It's agency specific, but at least there's a timeline. The timelines of the 1 year, 2 year, it states that, and the only way you can kind of uphold that timeline is if you want to send, the agency who's reviewing the EA or the EIS to court and say, hey, this took too long. You passed your 2 years, you're past your 1 year. That hasn't happened yet, but that's the only, again, like the recourse with NEPA is the only thing you can do is just sue the agency that's in charge of that document because they exceeded their timeline. And then the last thing is tracking your requirements. This is kind of new and everyone's kind of feeling their way through this, but all NEPA documents are required to have like a project tracking number. Think of like within Terracon, we have a tracking number, like a 8-digit number, 9-digit number. Probably within all the other companies that are on here today, you guys have something similar. You have a project number. All NEPA documents have to have that now too, and all documents that are associated with that project, whether it's an email, a report, delineation, a cultural resources report, an engineering design, they need to have that project number so that way it can be tracked and associated with all one big holistic project. Those are the 4 big new things that came in. So now that we know where this came from, kind of where we are today, why do you have to know what this is? Because a lot of federal funds are kind of around there, are floating around right now. A lot more projects than they used to be are required to do National Environmental Policy Act compliance. And basically it comes to federal funding. So if you have a project that's on federal land or you have to get a permit, say from the Bureau of Land Management or the FAA, you're having to, change your airspace. If you're having that federal activity, you're having to get a permit, you have to comply with NEPA. Or if you're receiving federal funds, whether it be a grant or a loan, or even, again, for housing authority, even like a mortgage assistance. So like it's a great rate of 1.8, that's still federal funding. And so therefore you have to comply with NEPA. And typically, like, again, it goes back to the dollars. And so just always think of that. Money changing hands, you're on federal property, or you're having to get a permit, you're gonna have to comply with NEPA. If you are like an agency and you're having to modify your plan, you're doing a cultural resources management plan, or you're changing, you're doing a master plan, NEPA would also apply. But typically the bigger triggers are dollars and permits. So the bottom line up front is, so now I understand what NEPA is, why we have to do it. Okay, comes with dollars. Why? What is the primary purpose of NEPA? It kind of comes back to why I started this journey within my professional life. Is it's planning. It's you're trying to consider your environmental values to make informed decisions so you can plan for any potential concerns or mitigation that's required. The justification or the reasoning for NEPA is to let everyone know, as a planner, as the public, as the applicant, as the agency, this is what we want to do, and this is what the impacts are going to be to the environment, and here's how we can mitigate for those. And that's the big primary purpose, is the making informed decisions, knowing the environmental values, what the impacts could be, providing data to make sure that the impacts can be mitigated. And also another thing is to involve the public. Again, going back to that public engagement. But NEPA is a planning document through and through. It's not to cause problems. It's not to cause any consternation or to stop a process. It's to provide information for you to move forward in doing your project in a clear, concise manner, but also hopefully in a beneficial manner to the environment and to human health. So from a planning perspective, is we're talking about baseline impacts and things like that, and well, so to do that, we look at all the regulations. So we look at air quality, historic resources. That's my high school. I was in that town the other day. Had to take a picture of it. We also look at T&E species. That's a burrowing owl. We look at threatened and endangered species, both at the state level and at the national level. And we look at wetlands, waters of the U.S., floodplains, more cultural resources. We look at archaeological sites. And then we also look at prime farmland, agriculture. Any kind of activity or any kind of resource that you could think of, we would take a look at it. We look at the rules, the regulations, whether it's state, local, or federal. And so that's why I always have the NEPA as an umbrella, because we cover everything. And that is, again, that's why it's a planning document, because you're not just looking at one thing at a time, you're looking at it in its entirety. Again, kind of going back to the encompassing thing of what we look for, like land use, air quality, noise assessments, the geology, type of soils, will there be additional soil erosion because of the project, water resources, all that laundry list of stuff. On the very bottom, climate change, resiliency, that is associated with the rule from previous year, from this year / last year, is we used to always look at what is the impact of the action, putting a building, to the floodplains, to the people downstream, to the air quality. Is it going to increase greenhouse gases, or put particulates out into the environment to increase dust? Now we have to look at resiliency and climate change. So will that facility, will that action, will that bridge, first of all, be resilient to sea level rise or an increase in fire from forest fires? Or will it potentially increase, fuel load for forest fires? But also too, from a climate change perspective, holistically, is it going to be a benefit to climate change? Is it going to have a way to reduce air emissions? Is it going to be able to reduce or increase efficiency of certain items? So we used to always be, we looked at the impacts, but now also we need to look at how that building or how that plan or how that activity will be resilient and hopefully be a benefit to the human health and the environment. And kind of like, how do we do that? How do we know if we need to look at land use? Or, hey, how do we know I need to look at, threatened and endangered species? Is there critical habitat? Or is there a floodplain nearby that I need to do a little bit more research on? Or as a planner, let you know that, oh, wow, there's some pipe and plover habitat on there. We shouldn't really look at it. We usually within Terracon look at Pivot, because Pivot pulls up, and I am not a GIS expert by any means whatsoever, which is why I love Pivot, because it's designed for people like me who don't know how to pull in layers. And I used to do it as code back in the day, but now I have no idea how to do that stuff. So I use Pivot to pull up what potential concerns are in the area. So, and it's all based upon, you can pull in a KMZ, or you can draw a square, and you can pull your project area. I just found a place in Colorado. You can go anywhere in the United States, put in your KMZ or put in your project area, and turn on your layers and look at, is there a species, is there critical habitat, are there wetlands? all these little dots here are potential wetlands, or is there a fault? So you can kind of look at this area and go, huh, okay, well, that's my project area. What do I need to dive further into? Do I need to get a survey done? Do I need to reach out initially to U.S. Fish and Wildlife to figure out there's critical habitat? Do I need to not potentially work in this area? Can I exclude this and just work in here? And that's where pivot comes in handy. It's because you need that you can do that all that stuff up front, and then like kind of like the deliverable that pops up as a report that says like, yes, there's no navigable waterways. Oh no, but there are existing pipelines. Let's take a look at that. There's an EJ community. Those are the kind of things that we look at from, before we go deeper into the NEPA process, because it either tell us where we need to go or where we not need to go, where we need to focus on or what we not need to focus on. But also, too, it helps us determine what our level of review is, whether it's a category exclusion, an environmental assessment, or an EIS. If you have impacts in these areas, you're going to completely, disturb a potential waters of the United States, the category exclusion won't apply. So you can either modify your project, or you have to do additional surveys or talk to the Corps. So that's kind of why we do all that work up front, so we know what level of review from a NEPA standpoint we can kind of provide to you guys as a client, or to the agency. And so for those levels of review, there are 4 within NEPA. There's exempt, which is an action that's precluded from NEPA. They have realized that it's just a transactional kind of activity. You're making payments, you're purchasing carpet, you're getting employees, you're restriping a road. You're just doing repaving. There's no environmental impact. You've been doing it for 20+ years. It's exempt. If there's a question as to where they're not quite sure if the action that you're doing has an environmental impact, but it's been done in the past and we think that there shouldn't be any environmental impact, that project can be what's called categorical excluded. And in the industry, we call them either KTEXs or CEs. That's a project that's typically has no environmental impacts, or very, 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 very minor, have been done before, and the level of documentation is streamlined. If you don't know what your impacts are going to be, or if your list of activities is not on a magical mystery list of category exclusions that each agency has, then you would follow an environmental assessment. Unless you know that, we are going to have significant impacts, we can't get around it, we can't mitigate for it, we are going to completely remove X. And then you can do an environmental impact statement. I will say that doing an environmental impact statement does not preclude you from doing your project. You are allowed to have impacts. You are allowed to say we can't mitigate for those. We acknowledge the fact that we can't repair what we're taking, and that's okay. The whole entire thing about NEPA again is planning. The government just wants you to know that this is coming up, and mitigate the best you can. Try to make everything whole, but know that you just can't. Most projects typically don't go to EISs unless they're large projects or the controversial projects. Most projects can be done as an EA, environmental assessment, with mitigation. And you can have mitigation all day long in an environmental assessment. That's okay. Again, you can have impacts. As long as you can mitigate for those impacts, you can do an environmental assessment. So again, like, how do I know if I can do a category exclusion versus an environmental assessment? Well, the biggest question is, do you know if you're going to have impacts or not? Yes or no? You're not quite sure. You get on here and you prepare an EA. If you know that the project's not going to have impacts, and there's also an agency list that says, hey, if you're restriping a road, category exclusion. Hey, if you're building on a parcel that's less than 10 acres, USDA, hey, you can do an environment category exclusion. Or even with the VA, less than 20 acres, categorical exclusion. If you don't know, if the answer is I don't know, always go back to EA. If you go down the process and you eventually figure out that you have no impacts, that's great. Continue on with the process because you're already halfway home. No reason to go back up to a category exclusion. Just keep on going. If you end up, like I said, going to like, there are significant effects, that's when you jump over to an environmental impact statement. and then you go on through, and you can notice there's a lot more steps along the way. So going back to those 3 levels of NEPA review, like I said, capital exclusion, those are typically like no action. There's no extraordinary circumstances. There's no like, oh, there is a wetland that has a sheepfrog, or we don't know really what the action what could happen. That would be then then you'd have to do an EA. But if everything is golden, you have no impacts, or it's on the list, you can do capital exclusion. It's agency specific, and they're typically checklists. You'll have 5 to 10 page checklists that you can complete. A lot of the information is usually provided as backup documentation, and you're just justifying your answers. The next thing I'll talk about, the next level, is an environmental assessment. It's a concise public document. I always say it's supposed to be concise. The days of a 200-page EA are long gone and dead. These documents are designed to be read by the public, designed to be understood by everybody. And so because of that, they need to be clear and concise, not a whole lot of jargon. It needs to be basically anyone can understand what's going on. You need to provide evidence as to how you determine that there's no impacts or less than significant impacts, and you to discuss your alternatives and your proposed action and how you got to this point. And again, this is not a checklist. This is a clear and concise document that goes to the public. Categorical exclusions are not provided for public review. Those are automatically assumed since there are no impacts, significant impacts. The public does not need to be engaged with it. But an environmental assessment does require a public engagement. And because of that, it's not a checklist, it's a long and winding road. Now, this is not designed to scare anybody. I just want everyone to understand, the difference between a checklist for a CE and then an environmental assessment is, and I shouldn't say VA only, sorry about that. It's all the bits and pieces that go along with it. So an environmental assessment looks very similar to an EIS. It's just much shorter and has less public involvement. But you have your purpose and need, the why of the project. You have your proposed action, what the project entails. What are the steps to get to the project done? Operation, construction, and then operation, and then decommissioning. Then you have that, and then you put that information out to the state and federal agencies and to the public as well. Like, okay, everyone. Okay, SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office. Okay, Army Corps of Engineers. Here's our project. We propose to do X because of Y, and it's located in Kansas. And we want your feedback. We want to know if you have any archaeological concerns or waters of the U.S. concerns, or from a public standpoint, if this is going to be a problem from you from an aesthetic standpoint. We want to hear from those we call stakeholders at that point. That's the time where we can go and if need be, modify the action to go, okay, well, you know what? There is a cultural resources site on the northwest corner of that square that you just saw earlier. Let's avoid that, and we'll just take that out of the project. Before we start going through the process, we're going to ask all those questions so we can modify as needed. Because I always say once the 1s and 2s are done, there's no backsies, and we continue on with the process and review all the impacts associated with it. So if you have to get permits, we'll note in there that a permit's required. You need to talk to this person and get this done. That's where all the other planning part comes in. If you end up changing your design after all this is done and you get a finding of no significant impact, or even before that, if you end up changing your project area to potentially like, well, since we're taking out that northwest portion, let's purchase John's property to the north and we'll add that parcel. Well, then you just changed your project area, and you have to go like, do not collect, don't pass go, don't collect $200. You can't get to here without going all the way back to here. So that's why we always like to have the input from all the stakeholders first. So that way, if you have to change your project, or if you have to purchase more property or figure something else out, we don't go through here, kill a bunch of time, and then have to start back over. And then here at the very end again, if there are mitigation measures, if a permit's required, again, that's okay. That's included in the environmental assessment. That's when you then, once that finding of no significant impact is signed, saying, okay, there's impacts, but they're not significant, but we are going to have to do mitigation, and here it is. And that's when you start doing that. And then there's that third level we talked about, because you've got chemical exclusions, you got environmental assessments, and then you have the environmental impact statement. That's when, again, like I mentioned earlier, there is a significant impact. You can't mitigate for it. And again, that's okay. It just means that you acknowledge it, you're doing your best, but you just can't get there. Or if you have public controversy, if when you go through that process on this checkerboard, if you get to here and you put it out to your initiating stakeholders, and there's a whole bunch of unhappy stakeholders, nonprofits, the federal agencies, you may have to go to an environmental impact statement, because it has a little bit more, it has more robust environmental review, but also has a lot more public engagement. It's not just like with an EA, you put your document out for public comment as well as having your stakeholders, but you have multiple meetings. You put the notice of intent to do an environmental impact statement in the federal registry. It goes out to, like God and country. You have a bunch of notices, and you have nonprofits or other companies that also look at those federal registries for those opportunities to make comments and to kind of put in their 2 or 3 cents. So if you go the EIS route, just know that a lot of times it is because there's public controversy and requires a lot more time and effort and a lot more engagement. And again, like examples of EISs, like I mentioned earlier, dredging activities from the Army Corps, going through the rivers or bay systems, or transit corridors. Because you're having to do condemnation. Currently, like in Texas, they're doing Interstate 45 is expanding. They're having to purchase properties that could be potentially an environmental impact statement. However, if the public is okay with how the process goes, it could still be an EI. It could still be an EA. But if the public is unhappy with the expansion, you're having to purchase a lot of property because of environmental justice issues. You're having to break up community groups. That's usually why transit corridors and environmental impact statements. Or if you're constructing something that's very complex. If you look at the nuclear, I always have a hard time saying that, Regulatory Commission, whenever they build anything, probably just also because it's inherent in their name, most of their projects are EISs just because of the materials that they work with and the potential safety concerns. It's not just the building's complex, it's just that the things that are within the building are complex and require additional information for the public, but also just additional study probably. I will say though, with EISs, there is a page limit. So it's 150 pages of just text. That doesn't include all the other surveys, but if it's a complex project, 300 pages. But again, page limit, timelines, that's all kind of dependent upon if somebody feels like having to throw a lawsuit someone's way. So I keep going back to, so how do EISs differ from EAs? Again, we've got more public involvement. You've got, like I mentioned before, stuff has to go out to federal registry. You get a notice of intent to prepare an EIS. You don't have that with an EA. You do a notice of availability for 45 days for draft EIS. Agencies for EAs can be 15 days, can be 30 days. EIS has to be 45. You have public hearings for draft EISs, oral comments, written comments, town halls, those kinds of things. And then again, you have another 30-day comment period for notice of availability of the final EIS. And then once a record of decision is drafted and prepared and signed, and that's when it's like the cover letter to the EIS saying, okay, this is it. This is the final document. We acknowledge the fact as a federal agency that these are the impacts and this is how it's going to be done. Here you go. You still have a public comment period for that. And because of that, it's a lot more expensive. It takes, as you can tell, it takes a lot more time. And because it's time and money, it just kind of always just goes back to being more expensive. So I always kind of head home with, kind of going back to the EAs and EISs and how do I pick and what's this and what's that is, a lot of the projects now, again, are having to do NEPA compliance because of federal funding, because of acts, because of grants coming through, people are being told you have to do a NEPA. Well, how do you determine what your level is? So typically, this is a little different, but renewable energy generation, usually if you get a loan or a grant, typically it can, if it's USDA, it would be an environmental assessment. DOE, they had just removed, if you go back to the initial slide, I talked about the new rules, the DOE has removed their acreage limit. So they used to have an acreage limit that said, if your renewable facility is going to be over, I can't remember the acreage, X number of acres, you have to do an EA and the category exclusion does not apply. Excuse me. They took those caveats out. So if you're doing a DOE project for renewables, more likely than not, it can be categorically excluded. But for USDA, they still have those in there. So that's why I have it as an environmental assessment, because they don't have those revisions haven't come through yet. They may be coming, but I haven't seen those yet. Other examples and associated level of environmental review of what type of NEPA documentation you'll need. Things like USDA cat exclusions have less than 10 acres. So whatever you want to build on that 10 acres, as long as it's under 10, that's 9.9 for your whole entire area of disturbance, including temporary. If it's less than 10, category excluded. And for VA, it's 20 acres. As you can see, every agency is different. And this is what I always throw in here. So you think, okay, well, USDA, okay, they say less than 10 acres, I can be categorically excluded. Great, that's just so much easier than an EA. However, the Animal Research Service has their own list. Even though they are part of USDA, they have their own, and they say you have to do an environmental assessment whenever there is ground disturbance. So you always have to double check to make sure that if you are having to do NEPA compliance with a federal agency, that you go to their specific guidance, their specific rules, because they could always throw in stuff like this into your like, oh, it's 10 acres, not a big deal. They're not part of the USDA program. That's not how it always goes. Other stuff for broadband, this had recently changed. Broadband used to have require a lot of environmental assessments, like for BEAD, for fiber optic. Now, broadband, National Telecom National Transportation Infrastructure Administration, NTIA, had put forth over 20 new categorical exclusions. So what used to be an environmental assessment, used to be required for an environmental assessment, can now be done with a categorical exclusion. So again, always go back and check on your regs whenever you're awarded a project. Or, if you're working on a highway, our multimodal facility for Federal Transportation Administration, Federal Rail, they have a laundry list of projects. And more than likely than not, that project can be categorically excluded under one of their options. As an example, I worked on a Federal Transit Administration project. We demolished a historic building, kept 2 facades, and were able to consider it categorically excluded. Because they had done it somewhere else before, they can say that there's precedent. Go back to that word, precedent. And therefore, that project where we removed a historic property, kept whatever bits and pieces we could that were considered historic, integrated them into the actual building, the new building, that was so categorically excluded. So FHW, like all the transportation, they're pretty open. And of course, those are, CEs versus EAs. Then the environmental impacts I go back to. Those are the big ones. Very rare, programmatic, big stuff. So when you're kind of thinking about from a planning perspective, it's when you're told you're having to do a NEPA, I would say doing a NEPA is kind of weird, but keep in mind this, this timeline. Those checklists can be 40 to 80 days. The bigger timelines associated with this portion here, which is consultation requirements. If you have to consult with the tribes and the State Historic Preservation Office because you're modifying land or a building, they have 30 days to respond. So that's why that, that timeline kicks up. For an environmental assessment, it's 180 days typically, but it does not include government review. So for example, within Terracon, if someone says, hey, congratulations, here is an EA, we can prepare the document, reach out to stakeholders, except for the tribes. We can do all that work. put it together, send it to an agency, because again, there's a federal nexus. The agency has to review it because that's their funds. There is no timeline for that agency to review whatever we provide to them. So it can be 10 days, 30 days, 45, whatever their timeline is. We're kind of just stuck with that. And it's not stuck's not a good word, but we're beholden to their availability. So just keep that in mind too, is that sometimes they're just slammed just as much as we all are. And so that timeline does not include the review. And of course, the environmental impact statement is, again, longer. So when you see all these, how do you, again, going back to how do you figure out, are there going to be resources? Am I going to have mitigation? What should I do? I always go back to how does pivot assist with NEPA, with our planning? So to me, it kind of just shows those constraints. It shows how do we prepare in those chapters 1 and 2, that proposed action, what resources we need to look at, how do we, and even kind of start thinking about how do we mitigate for those? Or could our project be, could it have public controversy? Is there a town close by that we just didn't see? Or is there an environmental justice community that's not going to like the project that we have? Using pivot kind of shows us what the potential pitfalls are. And again, kind of helps me figure out if it's going to be a category excluded or if it's going to be EA. And if so, how do I plan for that? Also, it kind of goes back to alternatives analysis too. If we have that box, you have that box here. Well, you know what? Maybe we need to move this box somewhere else and figure out, what's a better path. And if you are moving, from box 1 to box 2, you document that in your environmental assessment, and you show the federal agency and the public that you looked ahead. How did you determine that you weren't going to go from, you weren't going to use site A, but use site B? And you show them that you were forward thinking, you were looking at resources, you were looking at impacts, and this is how you got to go into my invisible box, how you got to alternative B over here. And it shows that you're being a good steward and you've done your due diligence. And so I think that's where pivot also comes into play, as you can help kind of use pivot to tell that story. So that's how I use pivot in the NEPA process, and that's kind of a brief overview of NEPA and little NEPA 101. And so now I know I've bombarded everyone with a ton of information. It is time for questions. And I hope you have questions, because if not, I will be very sad and have to start making some up on my own. But if there are any questions in the chat, Megan will provide those. But if you have any questions and you want to actually say them out loud, please raise your hand and we will address those as needed. But I hope this was helpful for everybody, and bombard away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer. Gosh, that was so helpful. I learned so much. And again, I know Elise said these, and Nicole both said these flowcharts, these graphics, they just help my brain at least understand this really complicated stuff. So thank you so much. So like Jennifer said, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat now. Otherwise, you can use the raise hand feature at the top of your screen. If you do that, I can then come in and unmute you if you'd like to talk. And we can go from there. All right, Yvonne, I'm going to get you unmuted. All right,
Hi
you
there,
should be able
thanks.
to talk now.
Yeah,
Hey,
thanks,
Yvonne.
Jennifer. Jennifer, you had mentioned an example where you had used pivot to help on a particular project. I thought it might be helpful to hear what that example was and how you were able to pivot based on what was identified within the constraints.
Yeah, so what we did in earlier, it was for a transportation project. So it was actually, so we were trying to figure out, we had a little drainage basin. And so we pulled in pivot. So we tried to figure out, we knew I didn't know, because I am not a transportation engineer by any means whatsoever, nor do I want to be one. But the engineers, as they got further on down the road at 90% of the design, they figured out oh, wow, okay, we do need to figure out where this runoff's going to go. And so they provided me a quick little information as to where they wanted to put it. I was able to pull up pivot within 5 minutes and go, okay, no, this isn't going to work. We have a Colonia here. We've got some other concerns over here. At this point, our NEPA document hadn't gone all the way through yet. So we were able to go, okay, so this alternative, this isn't going to work. Let's pick an alternative drainage area and move on from there. And that started the discussion. We're still not there yet of where we wanted to put it, but it started that conversation as, okay, that's not going to work. We need an alternative because it's, from a cost perspective and an impact to that colonia, that it just wasn't going to work. And we knew from a textile standpoint that they would not accept that either. So good question. Yeah, no, I mean, and I hadn't used Pivot, and this is fairly new to me as well. And it was because, again, I'm not a GIS person, so I was able to pull it up quickly and be able to answer the question on the fly, which for me is really good because no one likes to hear, let me get back to you on that. And then give me about 30, 40 minutes and I talk to the GIS tech. No, it was just great to be able to have that conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jennifer. All right, Kyle, I'm going to unmute your mic. And then Robert, I saw your question in the chat as well, and we will get to that next. All right, Kyle, you should be able to go ahead and unmute now.
Hey, thank y'all. Yeah, I have a super specific, complicated question that's given me fits, and
All right.
I'm hoping your answer probably doesn't matter to my project at this point, but my complaints can get smarter if you can answer my question. So I have a project that I'm working on that impacts jurisdictional wetlands and impacts a federal project. So I need permissions from the Corps of Engineers under both Section 404 and Section 408. And so what we're being told is, if regulatory had issued us a standard permit for our wetlands impacts, then that would have satisfied NEPA requirements for the Section 408 reviewers. However, it wasn't a huge impact. So regulatory issued us a programmatic general permit, which would have been great news, except that now the Section 408 reviewers are saying, well, that doesn't satisfy our NEPA requirements, so now we need an EA. And it's infuriating because basically, the people down the hall from you who are your environmental folks say that, hey, it's not really that big of a deal, just buy the mitigation credits. But now you've got to go through put us through this whole process to prove that it's not a big deal when your own people have already said that it's not. And so, we're at the point in the project where we're just going with it and trying to get there so we can build it. But my question is, is that a matter of policy at the Corps of Engineers that, I'm in South Louisiana, so we're very practiced at complaining to the brass with the Corps of Engineers. Is that a matter of their internal policy, or is that a matter of law where it would take legislation to remove that requirement, or to say, hey, a PGP2 satisfies NEPA, and so you're done,
Yeah, so from the 404, they've already gone through their NEPA process. That's why you have a nationwide permit or you have the regional general permits. They've already gone through that NEPA process. So that's why they're able just to say, check the box, NEPA's done. And yeah, if you would have gotten a standard permit, then yeah, you have to do your purpose and need, your alternatives analysis, your least practical. You go down that long list. So that would be, because they hadn't done the NEPA process for that standard permit because it's a standard permit. Every site's different. 408 looks at things differently. That's the kicker, is the agents, it's all core, but 408 people are over here and 404 people are over here, and neither of the tweens shall meet. So like I'll have, if I'm having like projects that have a potential concern of having to require both permits, I try to get all people in the house at the same time, because I've had that happen before. I mean, I've had people, not even at the Corps, I've had NIMS or other people like that go, oh, by the way, let's, I saw that you had already done this and the Corps had already approved it, but let's do this one thing one more time. So it's federal agencies just don't communicate internally very well. And so as a consultant and as an applicant, as a person who's having to get the permit, the onus, and it's not fair, is on us to kind of put together that team and ask those questions of the regulators to go, look, let's all get in a room together early and often, right? That's always the key term. And go, this is the plan. This is what we're going to have to do. Is everybody okay with that? And here, and here's our tasker list, and kind of hold their feet to the fire at that point. And everyone said, yes, we're okay. Feel free to get a standard permit and then turn in the certification and do it that way and document. But yeah, the Corps doesn't talk to one another. It really, truly doesn't. And it's just not fair. I'm sorry, Kyle. I wish I had a better answer for you, but it is
I mean,
not.
it's a
so
realistic
not
one
fair.
anyway. But I guess, it sounds like you're saying that that's not necessarily a legal requirement. That's just the Corps' internal policy in implementing this.
Yeah,
And so we
the
should,
core program managers or project managers who are assigned your permit should have talked to internally to figure out like, hey, how do we want to go with this? And let's have your 404 process match your 408 and kind of just make sure. Because yeah, you could have easily done an EA probably a lot earlier and incorporated the 408 and the 404 together, and it could have been a very quick and easy EA. You could
okay.
probably remove all your resources and just fully analyzed your surface water and your teen and your cultural and been done with it.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's helpful. Like I said, we just want to know who to complain to. So that's great. Thank you.
Complain, I'm like, yeah, complain to the government. Good luck with it.
Good luck, Kyle.
All right.
All right.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're absolutely right. We've got 2 questions in the chat, and then Cassidy, I'm going to call on you. So the first question is from Robert. He says, does the EA versus EIS determination occur after final POD submittal and before NOI?
So if you're not quite sure, I'm gonna go back to, oh, let's do this. Okay, so if you don't know, if you're going down the path and you find out that you have impacts that you cannot mitigate for, that's when you kick it over to an EIS. The NOI, notice of intent, is only for an EIS. So you can actually say, you know what, we intend to do an EIS if you're really not quite sure. We're going to go forth with this process. And you end up, as you're going through your EIS, you go, oh my God, we jumped at the gun and we really don't need it. That's fine. You're preemptively just saying to the world that we're going to do one. And then you just put a note saying that you're no longer going to do one and that you're going to fall back on an EA because you have no significant impacts. But typically the NOI comes out when you've gone through the process of an EA and you go, oh my gosh, we cannot mitigate for that. There is no permit in the world that will allow us to mitigate for this. It's going to kick us over. And that's when you do the notice of intent for an EIS. Does that make sense, Robert?
Thanks, Jennifer. Awesome. And then Nicole asked, will the process outlined in the flowchart change based on the lead agency? What happens when multiple agencies are triggered and how is the lead agency decided? Great question.
That's a toughie. Okay, so actually there's a project in Louisiana, Kyle, that we're working with multiple agencies on. It took us, we had informal conversations. You can only have one lead agency. You no longer have co-leads. You no longer have multiple agencies kind of thrown in. And we had a conversation with them earlier in the year. Everyone talked about, well, I'm going to be the lead, but I can't do this until we have a letter signed. 5 months later, we finally got a letter signed from the lead agency. It's basically, it can be anyone. So if you have 2 agencies, say the Army Corps and the FAA, whomever wants to take responsibility for doing the consultation with the tribes, who wants to take responsibility for signing that document, kind of making sure that it's fitting their standards, they're the ones who raise their hand. It's not like, I mean, if it's typically ones who have more, more federal requirements of like, hey, you're getting our money, but it's on your land. Well, we're going to be the federal lead. It kind of has to be a meeting of the minds, meeting in the middle of who wants to take on that ownership. I will say though, that say for example, so the U.S. Army Corps says, I will be the lead, and the FAA says, that's fine, that's great, you can be the co-lead, but we're not going to do anything until you have a signed letter. Until it has to be like official, there has to be some type of documentation that says who's going to do what. Now, keep in mind, the FAA can go, this is what happened to us just recently. Okay, I'm fine with being not being the lead, but I want this in the report. And so, for example, for the FAA, we have a whole entire separate chapter for them because they have a whole laundry list of stuff that the Army Corps doesn't typically look at. So even though the Army Corps is the lead, the FAA can still say, I want this, but well, I'm not going to take ownership of it. And that's how that works. This flow chart, like the big snaky, like that flow chart, if it's that one, that stays the same, except for when people are reviewing chapters 1 and 2. It doesn't just go to the lead agency. You still have to have buy-in from that other agency as well, the FAA for this example. So they're still reviewing things. It's just you're not really doing the document to their standards to where they're gonna officially sign off on it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. Cassidy, I'm going to unmute you. You can go ahead and ask your question, and then I see another question in the chat. So go ahead, Cassidy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to ask regarding section 408 in conflict with federal projects. Specifically, I work a lot with projects that are adjacent to levees in the Louisiana area. And in the past, we've communicated with the section 408 coordinator and point of contact in the Vicksburg district. But we haven't gotten a hard document stating like the linear feet that the project can be adjacent to the levees. I don't think that they have this. How would you recommend moving forward with trying to explain that in permits and reports without being able to cite specifically those links from the Vicksburg district?
This is going to be a horrible, awful answer, but every district is different. I feel horrible saying that. And I have yet to work in the Vicksburg office, but I have a feeling we've had people on this call who can help you. I just haven't. I've worked in other districts before, and that's the hardest part about Army Corps is every district is different, how they have their own little minor nuances. And but if you want to, shoot me an email or you can give me a call and we can go over your question and I can get you to the right people who can probably give you an answer. Just because I haven't worked in that district before, what I could give you may not work for your district. And I feel bad that you waited to ask that question, but I don't have a good answer for you. But if you want to call me after this or shoot me an email, and that's my information's up on the screen, and I will get you to the person who will be able to provide you a much better answer than I wish I knew, but I don't.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I'll do that.
Okay, great. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Essentially, my takeaway from this whole webinar is this is all clear as mud.
Corps is different. Army Corps has every district has their own little regime, and it's just a Galveston versus Fort Worth versus Albuquerque, and everyone's all different. There's no consistency in the federal government. That's why you have consultants. That's just
there you go. Exactly. Patty also asked in the chat, do you have a cheat sheet for the acronyms, which I would also like.
That's a very good idea. I can definitely get that. What I can do is part of the presentation that Megan has. I guess I can give you also the PowerPoint. I can provide that to you as well if you want to send that over. Yeah, I deal in acronyms. I'm so sorry,
yes.
Patty.
Good
question. Great. Good question.
So many things to learn. Awesome. Well, we are at time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. Again, if you have questions, if you think of things after this call, if you go back and talk to your colleagues and think of things, please feel free to reach out to Jennifer or myself. We want to thank you so much for spending time with us today. We will send you a copy of this recording. And again, feel free to forward it to anybody you think might be interested. Thank you, Jennifer, for your time and expertise. And we hope everybody has a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, for your time.